Sabotage. Be as quick as you can, Villa. With a place like this, there's bound to be a guard on patrol. Blake shivered as he watched Villa's gloved fingers working deftly on the lock. He had expected it to be cold, but not this cold. Almost done, replied Villa, but I've got to be completely sure that I've bypassed the alarm system. He paused for a moment, rubbing his hands together through the gloves. Then he took off the gloves to blow warm breath onto the skin itself and rub new life into his fingers. I'm freezing, he said, replacing the gloves. I hope it's warmer inside. I doubt it, said Blake. After all, the whole idea will be to keep the chemicals cool. It'll probably be like a refrigerator in there. He shivered again at the thought. Mind you, it was so cold outside that he wondered if they'd need refrigeration. Perhaps that was why they stored the chemicals here in the first place. After all, it must be almost the coldest place on Earth, with Arctic white stretching way into the distance, he presumed toward the North Pole. Just then, there was the sound of footsteps running. Blake looked up, but Villa didn't. He was at a crucial point and kept his eyes on the job in hand. The footsteps were approaching the corner of the building, a matter of yards away. Suddenly, a figure burst into sight and turned towards them, a dark silhouette against the ice. It was Callie. She was breathless from running. "A guard!" she blurted out. "I don't think he saw me, but Avon, he fell." "What happened?" "I don't know. I saw him fall on the ice as we dodged from the guard's view. I went to help, but he said it was no good. His leg was hurt. 'Leave me to fend for myself,' he said." Blake frowned. "And is the guard heading this way?" Callie nodded. "Well, if he turns up soon, it'll mean we're done for. And if he doesn't, it may well mean Avon's been caught." They listened, but could hear nothing. No, they were imagining it, hearing what they expected to hear. Or were they? A minute later, the faintest sounds became identifiable as slowly crunching footsteps. But was it one pair or two? There was the click of a lock. "Done it," said Villa. "We're in." Blake clutched Callie by the arm, as she seemed reluctant to move. "Come on," he said. "When we're safe inside, we'll see if Jenna knows what's going on." They closed the door firmly behind them. Then Blake did as he'd promised and contacted the Liberator. "Avon?" said Jenna. "It's all right. He's here. I had to bring him up, bad leg and all. He managed to get away before the guards saw him, but not without a twisted ankle and a possibly broken leg." "Okay," replied Blake. "We'll manage. If there's anything technical we need to know, we'll get back to you then." They moved through a wide lobby until they reached a door on the opposite side. A sign on the door said, "Main Store." Blake reached out for the handle, but Villa quickly pulled him back. "Careful," he said. "I think it's rigged. Either an alarm or some sort of electric shock. Look." He was pointing at a small box beside the door. He went over to it and fiddled around until he found a way in. Then he began to examine the intricate miniature circuitry. "Can you manage it yourself?" Callie asked. "Or do you need some help from Avon?" Villa considered. "No, I think it's quite simple. Just a question of finding the point of disconnection. A switch, perhaps. Ah, yes, here we are." He made the necessary adjustment. "That's it," he said. "But I think I'd better be the one to try it, just in case. My gloves are insulated." He turned the handle and pushed. Nothing happened. He tried again, but there was still nothing. "Locked?" said Blake. Villa nodded. Blake looked perplexed. "But there's no keyhole. So how does it work? How do we get in?" Villa shrugged his shoulders. "Let's try one of these other doors instead," suggested Callie, indicating 3 doorways along the left-hand side of the lobby. One was labelled washroom, another detoxification room. The third was blank. "How about this one?" said Blake, pointing to the unlabelled room. I reckon we should take one door each, said Villa. All right, agreed Blake. Everyone back here in 2 minutes. Neither Callie nor Villa discovered anything out of the ordinary. The rooms seemed to fit the descriptions, being eminently suitable for the rigorous washing and detoxifying procedures needed in this sort of building. But Blake was mystified. It seems this unlabelled room isn't used anymore, but there are signs of it once having been a reception room. And there's a small panel of controls with buttons and switches, like an old telephone switchboard, but nothing else in the room at all. Oh, except this. He showed them a piece of paper which gave a detailed plan of the building. It was very old and was dated 1994 of the old calendar. The room where he had found it wasn't marked as anything, while others were more or less what one would expect. Substore, packing room, superintendent, freezer room, refrigeration room, and so on. So, with all this to explore, was one locked door going to hold them back? And of course they had come here with a job to be done. They contacted Avon to see if he had any ideas about the circuitry in the box. Well, in theory it's simple enough, he said. You'll have to return that switch to its original position and find another switch that triggers the alarm rather than the lock. Villa examined the box again. It's no use, he replied at last. I can't find anything. I thought as much. It's probably invisible and worked by an electronic beam. We can't get in then, said Blake. Well, there is another way. He paused. Well, go on. I don't know. It'd be tricky even for me. Well, can you make it with your leg? No, he cannot, interrupted Jenna. No way. In that case, we'll have to manage without, said Blake. What do we do? You'll have to feed in a resistance that's strong enough to cut off the alarm without affecting the beam. But it's not as simple as it sounds. It'll have to be in exactly the right place and of just the right strength, or else you'll either not effect the cut-off properly, or else cut out the other switch as well so that the door won't open at all. But how do we do it? Asked Callie. You'll need a special tool. I'll send it down with Jenna and she'll explain. Minutes later, Jenna materialized in the lobby. She was holding a blue box with an attachment a bit like a half-open blunt pair of scissor blades. There was an illuminated dial and 2 control knobs on the box itself. Jenna showed the others how one of the knobs controlled the distance between the blades, while the other affected the strength of resistance. This was shown by a reading on the dial. She handed the resistance brackets to Villa, who carefully followed Avon's instructions step by step, until at last the operation was complete. Just one final check, said Avon. You don't want to short out the whole circuit, or there'll be no way in. Finally, he was satisfied, and Villa told Blake he could go ahead. This time, on turning the handle, the door responded to the slightest push, and Blake gingerly opened it and looked in. The large room was more or less as he'd expected. There was row upon row of bottles along one side, and larger containers both down the other side and along the middle. They entered the storeroom and shut the door behind them. Now, where were the chemicals they were after? They had no idea whether the substances in this store were the made-up chemicals the Federation used, or just the basic ingredients which had to be processed elsewhere. They would have to find out what the chemicals were, or else take samples of all of them. Blake examined the labels, but they were no help. The bottles were identified merely by a combination of letters and numbers, the containers by a simple pattern resembling a computer printout. By now, Jenna had returned to the Liberator, but Callie and Villa followed Blake through the store to the room marked on the plan as the sub-store. Perhaps we'll have more luck there, thought Blake. The door was open wide, but they remained on the threshold looking in. This time there were no chemicals. Instead, there was a workbench at each side of the small room. There was nothing on them apart from racks of test tubes, looking as if they'd not been recently used. On hooks along one wall hung a mixture of overalls and what looked like an updated version of the gas mask. In one corner of the room stood a centrifuge. In another was a small cupboard. Blake shivered. With all the activity, he'd almost forgotten the cold, until now. Although actually it did seem colder here, as if they were being met by a colder front of air. Callie interrupted his thoughts. "Look at this on the door," she said, pointing at some writing they had missed. "Experimental reactions," she read. "Keep out authorized personnel only." Blake nodded. Yes, it seems they once did more than just store the chemicals in this place, despite what it says here. As he indicated the word substore on the plan, his eye caught sight of something else. "That's interesting," he said. "Can you see a door opposite this one? According to this plan, there should be an entrance over there into the freezer room." They crossed over between the benches to get a better look. But there was definitely no door, simply a bare, blank wall. Oh well, there must have been structural alterations since 1994. They probably decided they didn't need a freezer room after all, and I can see why. Blake shivered again. "Come on, let's try and get some samples from the store." He picked up a rack of test tubes and went back into the store, and Callie followed. But as Villa was about to follow her, he stopped as his eye fell on the cupboard in the corner. He went over and tried the handle, and it turned smoothly at his touch. He eased the doors open with the skill of a master thief, wondering again, like those of the quick-fingered trade, whether there would be anything worth his while. But the cupboard was completely bare. He felt around inside to make absolutely sure, then turned away. But as he did, he caught a slight movement out of the corner of his eye. A secret sliding doorway was opening in the wall. A cold blast of air shot through the widening crack. Was this the freezer room after all? And if so, why was it protected by such an unorthodox entranceway? As he moved into the room, Villa realized that when the door was closed, the whole room would work like a giant fridge, but that there were also some separate compartments equivalent to the freezer sections where you might put meat to keep it fresh. He examined the lever-like handle on the first compartment he came to, and it wasn't difficult to fathom how it worked. Inside, there were many shelf-like racks of chemicals in small, stoppered bottles, labelled this time with one letter, X, Y, or Z. Perhaps these might be the 3 vital ingredients? He'd better call Blake and Callie. But wait, what was this long, box-like affair in the corner? It looked like a coffin, very wide, and instead of a white cloth, a shroud of crystalline ice. Villa began to scrape away around the edge of the lid, using a flat piece of metal which had been lying around on the floor. The metal itself was covered with a thin layer of ice, which made it slip through his fingers. He tried to get a firmer hold and, using the palm of his hand, he pushed with the chiselling action through the ring made by his other gloved fingers. But again, the metal slithered and slid from one side to another, and only ended up chipping away the tiniest pieces of ice. Finally, he tossed the implement away and took out his gun. The beam tore into the ice, leaving a melted, trickling path. Villa fired again and again, until the last particles of ice broke away from the rim and fell to the floor. He lifted the lid. It came up slowly, with a rather chilling creak, as if it didn't like being disturbed after all that time. Then suddenly it fell back with a bang. Villa's face was white. The lid hadn't just slipped. It had fallen as he threw up his arms in astonishment. Just then, Blake appeared in the doorway. How did you get in here, and what on earth's the matter? He added, seeing Villa's mouth hanging open. Seen a ghost? Villa didn't answer. He just pointed to the ice-covered box. Then he slowly pulled the lid back up, and all three of them stood looking in. Blake broke the silence. I wonder how long they've been there, he said, and who they are, for that matter. They were looking down at two frozen bodies, huddled together, face up and side by side. Do we just leave them there? Asked Villa. I think we may be able to unfreeze them, said Callie. Look here! And she indicated a small control set into the box. A light was lit up against the word freeze. It only needed a small adjustment to turn that off and light up instead the bulb marked thaw. That done, they closed the lid and waited. The process took a long time, and though they would have liked to peek, it said quite clearly that the lid had to remain down until the operation was over. At last the light went out, and the green all-clear light came on. The lid could now be opened. But they didn't rush forward and hurl it open. Instead, they stood and listened for some sign of life, and, when nothing happened, they wondered if the figures were alive after all. Blake slowly eased open the lid. The water had all been drained away immediately by a strong pump, and the air inside was warm. Now there was movement, as the inhabitants of the box shielded their eyes against the light and huddled together even closer against the cold. But slowly they became more accustomed to this intrusion into their cocoon by the forces of the outside world, and, as Blake pulled the lid fully open, they struggled to make out who he was and where they were. It was like being reborn, except there was still the memory of before. They recognized the place, although it seemed somehow different. They did not recognize the face peering in at them. They began to remember more clearly. This was the Arctic Research Station, a cover for American scientists like themselves, working on important chemical reactions in the search for more and more potent weapons in the latest round of chemical warfare. It was 1994, or at least it had been 1994. One of them remembered he was called Mitchell, but known as XP3. XP for Experimental Department, of course. He remembered the other as XP7, but couldn't remember his name. In fact, he didn't think the other had a name. The face above them began to ask them questions. Why were they here? Were they for or against the Federation? How long had they been there? Did they know all the chemicals and what they were used for? Two more faces appeared. It was like being a fish in a goldfish bowl, the two scientists felt, being stared at like that. And the questions merely confused them, sending their heads swimming dazedly in all directions. But then, slowly and tentatively, although they didn't really remember they had voices, their answers, as they formed, came out as thoughts aloud. We've been here since 1990, and it is now 1994. That's 4 years. Who or what is the Federation, we do not know. And of course we know about chemicals. We are chemists. So you do know what they're for? Asked Blake. Yes, we know. They are for war. At least things were more equal then, before the new calendar, said Blake, before the Federation became what they are now. He told them all about the prisons, the chemicals, and his companions' escape, about their continuing battle with the Federation, their plan to sabotage the store, and of what they had found. Then he told them how important it was that they should help. You could identify the chemicals for us and tell us how they work. You could even help us sabotage the whole place. But how can we believe what you say? Said the one called Mitchell. That you are who you say you are. That you are not anti-American agents working on the inside, and that it isn't still 1994. Show us something. All right, said Blake, holding out his wrist. See this? I can use it to talk to someone on our spaceship, the Liberator. I can ask Jenna, our pilot, to bring us down a history of the universe in this new calendar. We found it in the ship when we borrowed it from the Federation for our escape. The two men seemed happy enough with this, so Blake told Jenna to teleport down and what she needed to bring. The chemists looked genuinely impressed as she materialized right in front of their eyes. And they couldn't argue about the calendar either. There it all was in black and white. By the time Callie and Villa had told them a few stories about the Federation and the many rebellions that died a death, they were all too ready to help. Meanwhile, their memories had been piecing together, and by now their chemical know-how was back up to scratch. They tested the chemicals X, Y, and Z thoroughly, and had soon identified the reaction that led to the widely used mind-controlling drug, the Federation's most powerful weapon. "What now?" said Blake. Mitchell suggested rendering each chemical inactive by treatment with another, but XP7 didn't agree. No, he exclaimed. "There's a much better way. We can combine them all with this one," he pointed to a colourless liquid marked simply Y5, "and end up with a totally harmless substance which they could do nothing with, and the reaction is irreversible." "Sounds ideal," said Callie. "Well, what do you think, Blake?" "What are we waiting for? That's what I'm thinking," he replied. The reaction was soon in full swing in the room, with the test tubes, overalls, and gas masks. But suddenly Mitchell began coughing, then so did XP7, and Villa, who was watching the chemist taking the new mixture from the centrifuge with great curiosity. They all began to feel a certain tightness in their chests. "You forgot the byproduct," cried Mitchell suddenly. "It must be a poisonous gas, at least in the cold. Stop the reaction, you fool!" But XP7 had seen the masks hanging against the wall. He dashed over and grabbed one, fastened it hurriedly, then threw the others' masks as well. "Now, let's get it under control," he said. "It shouldn't take too long." He began to try to stop the reaction, although of course there was no way of actually reversing it. Suddenly a bell rang. It went on ringing like a fire or burglar alarm. Blake decided it must have been set off by an accumulation of the fumes, but he was more concerned with the possibility of their being detected. "Quick!" he urged. "It won't take any guards long to locate us now." XP7 was doing the best he could, and Mitchell was helping. But still they were having trouble in stopping it. Although there were now less fumes being produced, they were still being given off. Callie swung round. She had heard a noise in the store. As she went to investigate, there was a blast of fire which missed her by inches. She ran back into the room, but as the guard came nearer, he began coughing and had to back off. "I bet he'll be back, though, with more of them," said Villa, "and masks." He's right, thought Blake. We're going to have to be ready to teleport up. In sabotaging the place, they had also made it a most dangerous place to be. The question was, could they just leave the two chemists behind, especially after all their help? "Almost done," said Mitchell. "Another couple of minutes, that's all." "Jenna, get back to the ship and prepare for us to follow," said Blake. "Callie, you go with her and prepare to return with extra bracelets for these two, okay?" But they had hardly gone when Villa reported more guards. They fired once, then again. Then there was silence. There was no coughing, which meant they must have got some protection this time. They were probably advancing slowly through the store towards them. "How long?" said Blake. "Just about there," said XP7. "Yes, that's—" But his voice faded out as he collapsed, dropping to the floor. Mitchell bent down to see what was wrong. "Oh no," he said, examining the mask. "He's had a leak. A slow leak. There's no hope." He stood up. But at least he's done the job. There was another shot, which ricocheted off the wall and just missed Blake. Well, we can't hang around, he said, turning to Mitchell. But we can probably manage to get another bracelet. Do you want to come with us? No, replied the chemist. Just leave me. I'm from another time. I'll probably age quickly now I'm out of the ice, too. No, put me back in the freezer, that's all I ask. Very well, agreed Blake. They rushed into the freezer room as Villa held the guards at bay with his own weapon. There wasn't much time. Blake shut the lid on top of Mitchell and switched over to freeze. Then he got straight onto Jenna. Right, just the two of us. Quickly now. And as he and Villa dematerialized, a ray of fire passed right through the spot where Villa had been standing in the doorway. Back on the Liberator, it was lovely and warm. Avon hadn't actually broken his leg, only strained it, and the sabotage had been successful. Yes, Blake could think of plenty to smile about. And for that, he really had two people to thank. A man in an icebox, and a dead man with no name.